It was merely a picture of a mother and her child. Yet, a closer look at the girl's hand would expose a devastating reality. The antique store on Decatur Street in New Orleans had known more prosperous times. Dust particles floated in the slanted beams of the afternoon sun, which pierced the dirty window panes and fell upon collections of neglected treasures that had once held great significance. That Thursday in March, Margaret Hayes, an expert in historical conservation, was not searching for anything specific. A hand-lettered sign promoting estate sale goods from nearby families had drawn her inside during her lunch hour. The proprietor, an older gentleman called Mr. Thibodeau, gave a vague nod as Margaret navigated the narrow pathways. She was nearing the rear of the establishment when a particular item captured her attention. A modest wooden case was wedged between a pile of aged periodicals and a discolored silver photo frame. Inside this box, enveloped in brittle, yellowed paper, was a single photograph. Margaret gently raised it into the light. The picture depicted an African-American woman and a young girl, possibly 7 or 8 years of age. They were clothed in plain but tidy garments, the woman in a dark dress with a white collar, the girl in a pale dress featuring a column of tiny buttons. The image seemed to originate from approximately 1905, judging by the fashion and the characteristic sepia coloring of the period. What struck Margaret instantly was the woman's countenance. Her face held a deep sorrow that appeared to go beyond the usual rigid formality of early 20th century portraits. Her hand lay on the girl's shoulder in a protective manner, yet the gesture felt less casual and more like a desperate effort to cling to something that was being lost. The girl was seated with absolute stillness, her gaze directed somewhat toward the camera. Her eyes were open, but they held an odd quality, a flatness, a lack of the vital light that even the most serious children from that time usually possessed in pictures. Margaret flipped the photograph over. On the reverse side, written in faint ink, were just 2 words, Emily, 1904. She inspected the image more thoroughly, her professional eye now detecting details initially overlooked. The girl's posture was excessively perfect, unnaturally stiff. Her hands, clasped in her lap, seemed deliberately arranged rather than relaxed. And then Margaret saw something that made her catch her breath. The girl's left hand looked slightly smeared, as if it had been steadied by another person during the long exposure time needed for photographs of that era. Margaret's pulse quickened. She had encountered similar images in her academic work, though never one that felt so personal, so sorrowful. She walked over to Mr. Thibodeau at the front counter. "This photograph," she said softly. "Can you tell me its origin?" Mr. Thibodeau adjusted his spectacles and peered at the Kent and picture in Margaret's hand. His aged fingers shook slightly as he accepted it from her. For a brief moment, a spark of familiarity showed on his face before it returned to the trained neutrality of a man who had spent a lifetime trading in the memories of others. "That arrived maybe a fortnight ago," he said, his Louisiana drawl rich and unhurried. "Came from an estate clean-out over in Treme, an old Creole family. The heirs were relocating, liquidating everything. Most of it was just common household goods, furniture, china, books, but there were some personal belongings too. This was in a trunk up in the attic." A cold feeling came over Margaret despite the day's warmth. Treme was one of the nation's oldest African-American communities, with a history reaching back to the early 1800s. If this picture had been stored there for more than 100 years, it might be possible to track down its story. Did the family say anything about the subjects in the Provictorview? "Photograph?" Margaret inquired. "No, ma'am. They didn't seem to know much about the older pieces," he said. Mentioned their grandmother had saved many heirlooms from earlier generations, but she'd passed about 5 years back, and no one had sorted through it all until recently. He paused, observing Margaret's expression. "You considering a purchase?" "Yes," Margaret replied immediately. "What is your price?" $20. Margaret paid and carefully placed the photograph into her bag. Later, in her office at the Louisiana Historical Society, she prepared her workspace with the meticulous care of a surgeon. She had specialized lamps, a high-resolution scanner, and analytical software for enhancing old images. This was now more than simple curiosity. Something about the photograph had gripped her. She scanned the picture at the highest possible resolution and opened the file on her large computer monitor. Zooming in, she began a systematic examination of every element. The woman's face showed indications of recent crying, a slight swelling around the eyes, a tension in her jaw. The setting was plain, likely a photographer's studio with a painted canvas backdrop depicting a simple interior scene. Then Margaret concentrated on the girl's hands. The right hand seemed ordinary, resting atop the left. But the left hand, the one that had first drawn her notice in the shop, displayed clear evidence of having been supported. As she digitally enhanced the area, she could discern what looked like a slender wire or stand beneath the girl's arm, partly concealed by the dress fabric. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her theory confirmed. This was a post-mortem photograph, a custom prevalent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially among families who could not afford portraits while their children were alive. When a child died, bereaved parents would sometimes hire a photographer to create one. Final image, frequently posing the deceased child to appear as if they were simply sleeping or sitting at peace. This understanding settled over Margaret with a palpable weight. She had academically studied post-mortem photography during her graduate studies, but scholarly knowledge did not insulate her from the emotional gravity of holding such an intimate moment of mourning in her hands. This was not merely a historical object. It was a mother's final opportunity to possess a physical memento of her daughter, a heartbreaking endeavor to capture a moment before burial made the loss absolute. Margaret commenced deeper research into the practice, focusing specifically on New Orleans in the early 1900s. The city had been a cultural crossroads, and photographic studios had catered to all communities, though African-American families often had fewer choices and faced steeper costs. For an impoverished black family in 1904, commissioning even a post-mortem photograph would have constituted a major financial sacrifice. She retrieved several reference texts and began comparing them with known photographic studios operating in New Orleans during that period. The backdrop style, the lighting techniques, and the photograph's mounting offered clues. The cardstock on which the image was mounted lacked any photographer's imprint, which was uncommon. Most studios proudly embossed their name and location on the back. This hinted at either a very small business or perhaps a photographer who primarily served an African-American clientele in an era when such services might not have been widely publicized. Margaret made a note to conduct research at the New Orleans Public Library. The following day, Margaret went directly to the archives. They housed a vast assortment of municipal directories from that era. As night fell, Margaret found herself unable to look away from the picture. The mother's expression tormented her. There was something in her gaze beyond sorrow, a resolute will. This woman had been determined to have this picture taken. She had dressed her daughter with precision, arranged her posture meticulously, and remained seated beside her for what must have been an agonizing duration while the photographer prepared the shot. Margaret now observed other subtle elements. The woman wore a tiny brooch on her collar, a simple piece, probably of little monetary worth, but fastened with clear intention. The girl's dress, while unadorned, was immaculately clean and neatly ironed. Even in death, this mother had demanded dignity for her child. The name, Emily, reverberated in Margaret's thoughts. Just Emily, no surname, no specific date, other than the year 1904. It was a terribly small fragment of information to build upon, yet Margaret felt an undeniable drive to learn more. This photograph had endured for over 100 years, kept safe in a Treme attic. Someone had valued it enough to preserve it, even after its original story had faded from memory. Margaret took another picture of the back of the photograph, experimenting with various lighting positions. Occasionally, old handwriting could reveal hidden details under specific illumination, but the script remained frustratingly simple. Just those two pieces of information, a name and a year. Friday morning dawned with the familiar, heavy humidity of New Orleans, the air so dense it clung to you like an extra layer. Margaret was at the doors of the New Orleans Public Library before its official opening time, holding a folder containing copies of the picture and her initial observations. The Louisiana Division contained one of the most thorough assemblages of regional historical documents in the southern states, and Margaret had passed many previous hours there on other research endeavors. The head archivist, James Winters, knew her at once. A retired professor with many years of expertise, He had become Margaret's unofficial guide and advisor since she had relocated to the city 3 years earlier. "Margaret," he said, greeting her with a kind smile, "you have that particular expression. You've discovered something, haven't you?" She showed him the photograph, describing how she had come across it and what she had concluded so far. James examined the image intently, his experienced gaze absorbing the same clues Margaret had identified. "Post-mortem," he stated softly, "a poor dear child. And the mother, look at her face. She is maintaining her composure through pure force of will." He turned the picture over, inspecting the cardboard backing. "No studio imprint. That is notable. Let me show you something." He guided Margaret to a part of the archives she had not previously visited, a section holding commercial records and early 20th century city directories. He selected several volumes dating from 1903 to 1906. African-American photographers working in New Orleans during this time were not always included in the primary city directories, James clarified, but they were there, serving their own neighborhoods. Some left evidence in church newsletters, advertisements in the black press, or municipal business licenses. They passed the morning sifting through the documents. Margaret located 3 photographers who had worked in or around Treme between 1903 and 1905. One name appeared more consistently than the others: Arthur Boudreau, who had run a modest studio on Phillip Street. "Boudreau," James murmured, thinking, "I recognize that surname. One moment, please." He left for the restricted archive storage and came back 20 minutes later, carrying a thin folder. Inside were several papers pertaining to Arthur Boudreau: a business license from 1898, a notice of his studio's closure from 1912, and, most compellingly, a handwritten page from a ledger that seemed to itemize clients and services rendered in 1904. Margaret's hands trembled a little as she reviewed the ledger. The entries were brief, many containing only given names or partial details. Then, near the middle of the page, she saw it. "Emily, memorial portrait, October 14. October 14th, 1904. The date aligned with the year written on the photograph. "That's her," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. "It must be." But there was no family name, no street address, no further descriptive information, just Emily and the nature of the service provided. Memorial portrait, the common euphemism for photographing the deceased. The date of October 14th, 1904, provided Margaret with a vital beginning. If Emily had passed away just before the picture was taken, there ought to be a corresponding death certificate. New Orleans had kept death records since the late 19th century, though documents for African-American citizens were occasionally inconsistent or archived in separate collections. Margaret spent the remainder of the day at the Louisiana State Archives, searching through death records from September to November of 1904. The work was slow and profoundly saddening. A great many children had died in that period from tuberculosis, flu, mishaps, and illnesses that are now easily treated. Every entry signified a personal catastrophe for a family. But Margaret was searching for one particular loss. She found 3 girls named Emily who had died in that period. The first was Emily Rousseau, aged 12 too old, judging by the picture. The second was Emily Martin, aged 3 too young. The third was listed only as *Emily, colored, age approx. 7 to 8 years, died the 11th of October 1904. Margaret's breath hitched. October 11th, just 3 days before the photograph was taken. The age matched, but the record was maddeningly brief. The cause of death was listed merely as fever, a general term that could have indicated anything from typhoid to scarlet fever. No parents' names were listed, no home address, no other particulars. This was typical for records involving impoverished African-American families of the time. Children who died were often registered with the barest details, particularly if the family had little money or formal paperwork. It was a sobering reminder of how many lives had moved through history, leaving almost no mark. But Margaret knew that a lack of formal documentation did not mean a lack of a past. She needed to search in other places, in parish records, in spoken histories, and in the recollections held by the community itself. She contacted several historical churches in Treme, inquiring if they held any baptismal or burial records from 1904. Street, Augustine Catholic Church, one of the country's oldest African-American Catholic parishes, was the first to reply. Their records were comprehensive, fastidiously kept by generations of priests who understood they were preserving not only religious rites, but proof of their congregation's very existence. The church's archivist, Sister Marie, invited Margaret to come by the following Monday. "Our records extend back to the 1842, she mentioned over the telephone. "If this little girl belonged to our parish, she will be in our books." Margaret spent the weekend unable to focus on anything else. She had made an enlarged print of the photograph and fixed it to her office wall, examining it during pauses in her other projects. The mother's face had grown familiar to her now, as had Emily's serene expression, the expression of someone in an endless sleep. Street Augustine Catholic Church stood firmly on Street Claude Avenue, a monument to faith and endurance. Its walls had observed weddings and christenings, funerals, and community celebrations through the eras of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and into the present day. Walking through its doorway on Monday morning, Margaret felt the profound gravity of that long history. Sister Marie greeted her in the church office, a compact space filled with filing cabinets and shelving units of leather-bound archival books. The elderly nun possessed gentle eyes behind her circular spectacles and moved with the deliberate caution of a person who comprehended the delicate nature of aged papers. "These volumes are sacred," Sister Marie stated, retrieving a book labeled 1903 to 1906 from its place. "They recount our past, our identity. Every single name holds significance." They settled together at a wooden table, its surface polished to a smooth sheen by years of handling. Sister Marie opened the heavy book to the burial registry for October 1904. Her finger moved slowly down the page, past a column of names and dates, until it came to a rest. "Here," she said quietly. "Emily, October 13th, 1904. Margaret moved closer. The inscription stated, "Emily, daughter of Ruth, age 7 years, died October 11th, a fever. Buried October 13th, 1904. Plot 47, Street Louis Cemetery No. 2. Father unknown, Ruth." Emily's mother now had a name. "Is there a record of her baptism?" Margaret asked, her voice strained with feeling. Sister Marie turned the pages to an earlier section of the registry. She traced a line down the entries from 1897, then stopped. "Here, Emily, born June 3rd, 1897. Baptized June 20th, 1897. Mother, Ruth Williams. Father, not recorded. Williams, Ruth Williams, and her daughter, Emily." The father not being listed was not unusual, Sister Marie explained with a soft tone. Sometimes the fathers had died, sometimes they had moved on. Sometimes it was, she hesitated, searching for the right word, a complicated situation. We documented what the mothers provided. Then Margaret took out the photograph and presented it to Sister Marie. "This is them. This is Ruth and Emily." The nun looked at the image for a long moment, making the sign of the cross over her chest. The poor soul. She lost her child and still managed to find the means for this portrait. That tells you all you need to know about the depth of her love. "Is there any other information in the records about Ruth?" Margaret inquired. "Did she remain in the parish? Is there a record of marriage? Any other children?" Sister Marie turned the pages with great care, her eyes scanning the lines of script. Then she stopped again. Oh my. She pointed to an entry from February 1905, a mere 4 months after Emily's passing. Ruth Williams, aged 29 years, died February 3rd, 1905. Cause, grief and consumption. Buried February 5th, 1905. Street Louis Cemetery No. 2, Plot 47. The words seemed to linger in the quiet room. Grief and consumption. Tuberculosis was often termed consumption, but the priest who had written the entry had placed grief first. The detail that both Ruth and Emily were interred in Plot 47 meant they were united in death. Margaret was aware that St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 remained a functioning historical burial ground, though many of its most ancient sections had deteriorated over time. The cemetery had been founded in 1823 and had served as the final resting place for numerous members of New Orleans' African American and Creole populations. That afternoon, Margaret secured authorization from the Archdiocese to visit the cemetery to locate the grave. The cemetery superintendent, Mr. Duchamp, met her at the entrance with a map that was more gaps than information. Plot 47 will be in the old section, he informed her, leading her along eroding pathways past above-ground vaults in different stages of decay. A great many of the markers are gone now, stolen, worn down by the elements, or simply lost to the years. They walked for a quarter of an hour, Mr. Duchamp checking his map and occasionally verifying plot numbers on the few legible headstones they passed. Finally, he halted in an area where the grass grew high and untamed. "It should be right around here," he said, "but I must warn you, it is very likely there is no marker remaining." Margaret began a systematic search, moving vegetation aside, looking for any indication of a grave marker. Some plots had simple crosses, others had flat stones that were almost submerged in the soil. Many had nothing at all. Then, in the shadow of a larger, familial tomb, she found it. A small, flat stone, fractured and heavily worn by time. She knelt and carefully cleared the growth around its edges. Letters were faintly visible, eroded by more than a century of weather and neglect. She used water from her bottle and a soft brush to gently clean the surface. Slowly, words became clear. Emily Williams, 1897, 1904. Ruth Williams, 1875, 1905. Mother and daughter, reunited in heaven. Someone had cared enough to pay for a marker, however simple. Someone had ensured their names were inscribed, that their bond was memorialized in stone, just as it had been preserved in the photograph. Margaret sat back, tears tracing paths down her cheeks. She had found them, not merely their names in a ledger, but their actual physical resting place. Ruth had lived only 4 months after losing Emily. The sorrow had been too immense, worsened by sickness and likely by poverty, and the brutal difficulties of being a single black woman in the Jim Crow South. She took pictures of the marker from several positions, recording its state and precise location. Then she simply remained there for a time, keeping them company. The cemetery was silent, save for the calls of birds and the far-off hum of city life. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "I'm sorry your time together was so brief. I'm sorry the world was so unforgiving. But I found you. Your photograph endured. Your story endured." Back at the Louisiana Historical Society, Margaret started assembling the wider context of Ruth Williams's life. The 1900 census offered key details. She located Ruth residing in a small home on Street Ann Street in Treme, listed as Ruth Williams, Negro, female, age 25, laundress, widowed. So, there had been a husband, Emily's father, even if he wasn't named in Emily's baptismal record. Margaret checked death records from 1896 to 1897 and found him. Thomas Williams, Negro male, age 28, died March 15th, 1897. Cause, accident at docks. Emily had been born in June of 1897, meaning Ruth had been pregnant when Thomas died. She had been widowed at 22, expecting a child, and had raised Emily alone for 7 years, working as a laundress, one of the few occupations available to black women at the time, involving back-breaking labor for very little pay. Margaret arranged a meeting with Dr. Patricia Johnson, a historian who specialized in African American life in early 20th century New Orleans. Over coffee at a cafe near Tulane University, Margaret shared her entire discovery. Ruth Williams represents tens of thousands of women whose histories we have lost, Dr. Johnson reflected. Single black mothers in the Jim Crow South existed with almost no social safety net. They worked impossible hours for wages that could barely support them, and when their children fell ill, she paused, a wave of emotion on her face. They had very limited access to health care, sometimes none whatsoever. A fever that might have been treatable for a white child with a private doctor could be a death sentence for a child like Emily. The death record listed grief and consumption, Margaret said. Could grief truly have been what killed her? In a manner of speaking, yes, Dr. Johnson answered. Tuberculosis was widespread in the impoverished, densely populated districts. Ruth likely already carried the illness. Many did, often from laboring in humid, poorly aired environments. The strain and heartache of losing Emily would have compromised her natural defenses, hastening the disease's progression. And then, there is the chance she simply surrendered the desire to continue the struggle. When you have lost all that gives your life purpose, when you are drained, ill, and completely alone, sometimes the spirit simply releases its hold. Margaret considered the photograph once more, the resolute will visible in Ruth's expression. She ensured that photograph was taken. That wasn't an act of surrender. No, Dr. Johnson concurred. That was love. That was her guaranteeing Emily would not disappear from memory. In a society that often acted as if people like her were invisible, she declared that her daughter was significant. That portrait was a gesture of defiance, of integrity, of a mother's love insisting on its place in a world that sought to overlook them both. But Margaret felt a growing resolve to uncover more about Arthur Boudreau, the photographer who had crafted this enduring tribute for Ruth and Emily. She went back to the archives and located further details about him within the records of the Freedmen's Bureau and in African American periodicals from that time. Arthur Boudreau had been born enslaved in Mississippi in 1858. After gaining his freedom, he had traveled to New Orleans and, by some means, mastered the craft of photography, perhaps as an assistant to one of the city's established photographic artists. By 1898, he had established his own studio, modest but meaningful, catering to the African-American residents of Treme. In a copy of the Southwestern Christian Advocate, a black Methodist newspaper from 1905, Margaret discovered his obituary. He had passed in December 1912 at the age of 54. The notice described him as a man of profound empathy who believed that every single life was worthy of remembrance, irrespective of a person's situation or financial means. That phrase, regardless of ability to pay, held Margaret's focus. She returned to the ledger page from Boudreau that James had located. Beside the entry for Emily, in the margin, was a small, handwritten note, no charge. Boudreau had taken the picture of Emily without payment. Margaret could now envision the scene with painful vividness. Ruth, shattered by sorrow and despair, somehow hearing of Boudreau's studio, perhaps from a fellow parishioner at church, making the difficult journey there with Emily's body. Or perhaps Boudreau had gone to her, transporting his cumbersome equipment to Ruth's humble dwelling. The meticulous preparation, Ruth's hands shaking as she fastened the buttons on Emily's finest dress. Boudreau working with hushed respect and kindness, understanding this widowed mother could never compensate him, but proceeding regardless, because it was a moral necessity. And Ruth, seated beside her daughter's form for the lengthy exposure time, maintaining her composure through sheer determination, ensuring this single image would endure proof that Emily had existed and been cherished, had held value. Margaret found the tears returning as she sat at her desk. They were not entirely tears of sadness, but rather tears of profound respect for the human capacity to affirm life in the face of immense hardship. Ruth and Arthur Boudreau had together created something that had lasted over a century, not merely a picture, but a testament to love, to dignity, and to the unwavering conviction that every life possesses inherent worth. The photograph was no longer just a relic of history to Margaret. It was a hallowed item, a fragment of a human heart preserved on paper. Margaret dedicated the next 3 months to fully reconstructing the story of Ruth and Emily. She composed a detailed article for the Louisiana Historical Quarterly, chronicling her entire discovery. She also curated a display at the Louisiana Historical Society named Seen and Remembered, Memorial Photography in African American New Orleans. The portrait of Ruth and Emily was the focal point, presented with appropriate archival care in a humidity-controlled display. Alongside it, Margaret placed reproductions of the documents she had uncovered: the death certificates, the parish registries, the census details, the cemetery records. She also provided historical background on post-mortem photography, the lives of laundresses in the Jim Crow South, and the compassionate work of Arthur Boudreau. But Margaret wanted to do more. She reached out to a cemetery preservation group and organized for Ruth and Emily's gravesite to be cleaned and consistently cared for. A new, supplementary plaque was installed beside the aged stone, protecting the original while ensuring the names would be readable for generations to come. On a clear Saturday morning in June, the month of Emily's birth, a brief dedication was held at the cemetery. Sister Marie from St. Augustine Church gave a blessing. Dr. Patricia Johnson spoke about the historical importance of Ruth and Emily's narrative, and Margaret read aloud from correspondence the exhibit had inspired letters from Arthur Boudreau's descendants, from fellow historians, and from everyday visitors who had been deeply touched by the photograph. One letter was from an elderly woman named Grace, now in Houston, who had grown up in Treme. She wrote, "My grandmother would sometimes speak of a Ruth who lived on their street when she was a child. She recalled when Ruth passed, how the entire neighborhood grieved for her, because she had always been so generous to everyone, even though she had so little for herself. My grandmother said Ruth would sometimes sit on her front step, holding a photograph and weeping. Now I understand which photograph that was." After the ceremony, Margaret stood by herself at the grave for a few final moments. She had brought fresh flowers, lilies and roses, in white and yellow, the colors of hope and memory. "Your story is known now," Margaret said softly. "People see you. They understand what you endured, what you overcame, how deeply you loved. Emily is not forgotten. You are not forgotten. That photograph you fought so hard to have made, it accomplished precisely what you intended. It kept her memory alive. It kept you both alive." A gentle wind stirred the cemetery trees, and Margaret chose to see it as a sign of acknowledgement, of peace. She had done what she could. She had taken a picture discovered in a dusty antique store and returned to it its full story and significance. The exhibit remained for 6 months and became one of the most attended shows in the Historical Society's recent history. Visitors would stand before the photograph of Ruth and Emily for extended periods, many with moist eyes. They saw not only death, but love, not only loss, but honor, not only a moment in history, but a shared humanity. Margaret kept a copy of the photograph in her office. On days when she felt overwhelmed by the vastness of historical silence, by the innumerable stories that would never be told, she would look at it and remember, every person matters. Every life deserves to be witnessed and remembered. And sometimes, if you pay close enough attention, if you invest enough of your heart, you can build a bridge across time and give a voice to those who were silenced. Ruth Williams and her daughter Emily were no longer just forgotten names in old ledgers or anonymous faces in a vintage photograph. They were known, they were remembered, they were loved, not only by each other in their short time on earth, but by everyone who now encountered their story and was, in some small way, transformed by it. In the girl's hand, the hand that revealed a profound truth, held steady for a portrait that would outlive them both, there was a message that surpassed death itself. Love persists, memory endures, we are here. We matter, we were here.